Hello, very beautiful community. As Ukraine's war on Russian soil escalates, we're going to look at the reactions of ordinary Russians who have lost everything to do with their small business in the last 2 or 3 days of Ukraine's attacks on the Russian Amazon, a company called Wildberries, and their storage facilities across the country. This generated dramatic visuals. You can see it here. It generated both loss of life and significant numbers of injured. This whole drama was made more toxic in the Russian informational environment by allegations that the facilities botched up the evacuation process, allegedly to minimize theft, but Wildberries have come out and outrightly denied that there was an issue with evacuation. One of the storage facilities attacked yesterday was used by Wildberries but not owned by Wildberries, and in fact its ownership seems to extend to a character called Mr. Raldugin. Now, I won't tell you much about Mr. Raldugin or that chain, except to say that when very big things are owned by Mr. Raldugin, you can associate that with Mr. Putin. So effectively, a site was attacked yesterday whose ownership is associated with Mr. Putin. Now let's look at a few of the reactions. The first one has subtitles. I've taken out the swear words, so I won't translate it as we go. So we're just going to stop it here. Wildberries released a new clause to the contract these folks have with it, which basically said that if we're hit by drones, we aren't going to compensate you. We'll say a little bit more of that, about that in a second.
Естественно, нам всем скажут, что никакой товар не уцелел. Не знаю, что будем продавать машину, квартиру, не знаю. А теперь у меня просто не с чего зарабатывать. Что еще куча таких же людей в такой же ситуации, в таком же ахуе, что они будут делать тоже, я не знаю. У меня в городе нет бензина, нет электричества, я думаю, да ладно, проживем, все хорошо. Это все, когда какого-то варианта, что все хорошо и радужно его не существует, правильно?
So the motivation behind videos like this is twofold. One is folks have lost their small business, they've lost their livelihood, and so they have access to social media and they're emoting about it. But apart from emotional release, the other aim is, of course, to put pressure via kind of a collective flooding of the internet with these videos, both on Wildberries and on the regime. Pressure on the regime to put pressure on Wildberries to do more about this, rather than say, hey guys, we told you about the drones, how they don't count, so it's the drones, they don't count, you're on your own now. Tatiana Kim, the CEO of Wildberries, said that these folks are going to get discount for future usage of the storage facilities, and that they're going to take a month to reflect on positive financial compensation. But as this wave builds, there's going to be agitation and tension and pressure on the company and on the regime to pressure the company to do more for these people who've lost everything, because the losses have been already estimated as transcending $1 billion. And if you think of these as small businesses, that's going to affect a lot of people. So this is a collective action to pressure the regime and pressure the company into doing something more than just telling people, tough luck, we told you about the drones, and it's the drones. Another thing you witness in this video is, of course, a complete absence of politics. Now, two things can obviously be said about this. The last thing you're motivated to do is criticize the regime when you want your money back, because you're just not going to get your money back. You could get a jail sentence. But also, there is just this sensation the Russian population has that they share a territory with an authority that seems to have power on the territory on which they live, and you have to negotiate with that authority. You can't change it. You can't even change its behavior. You can't even understand this behavior. So there is a kind of corrosive colonial sense of depoliticization, that there's this kind of colonial relationship between Russians occupying the territory and there being this regime that happens to run the territory. This is obviously going to be a very hyperbolic thing to say on my part, but it almost goes 2 or 3 steps out of 10 toward a scenario where Russians are indifferent as to whether they're run by the Russian authority or by Ukrainian authority, if Ukraine had the power to take over all of Russia. Because the question is, I am here trying to make a livelihood, and then some people have power over this territory, and what I care about is how this impacts me, how this impacts my family, but there is no access to a sense of a common civic feeling that even allows people to properly say, the way folks in the West could, and indeed the way folks in Ukraine can, that for better or worse, this government is our government. They don't experience it as being their government. They experience it as being a government that runs stuff on the territory in which they happen to live. And now they've lost their livelihoods and lost a lot of money. So the question is, can this government be pressured to do something to reverse some of these losses? Let's watch a little bit more. Today, a storage facility on Wild Breeze got burnt down, where we had our products. I'm a single mum. I live in a rental. And I've got a mortgage for a construction process for a property I can't live in yet because it's being built. Another one? We did the new contract. And only discovered in the news today that they added a little note saying that if something pounds into the facilities, we're going to get absolutely zilch compensation. Now, because of what I've just said about depoliticization, none of this is going to destabilize the Putin regime. However, this is stuff that sort of pours poison into the foundation of the regime, which in itself can't destabilize it, but which will get activated at a time when the destabilization of the regime occurs. In other words, this, so far, and even worse versions of this, will not politicize Russians. But what they'll do is make the scenario when politicization is actually triggered in Russia much more toxic and dramatic and existential for the regime. So understand this as a kind of investment into instability, if you see this from the point of view of Ukrainian tactics and strategy, but not an investment into instability that can itself trigger instability. It's an investment into instability that will make the instability worse when it is triggered by other factors, but not these factors which won't trigger it, even if this kind of story is dramatized. Now note, part of the reason Wild Breeze are talking about giving people discounts for their facilities is not just about compensation, it's also about the fact that folks are now going to be thinking, well, maybe I need to readjust the way I do business, because if I'm going to work with these big companies that Ukraine keeps associating with the Russian state, I'm going to keep losing my stuff. So there is certainly going to be a kind of a multiplication of this sort of latent toxicity built into the future, but there is not going to be any trigger that this sort of pressure the Ukrainians are putting on Russia generates. Now let's look at this a little bit from the Ukrainian point of view. There has been some evidence that gear to do with Russia's war is being sold by some people who use this company Wild Breeze. There's also been the argument about the links of wild breeze to the regime. There has also been a set of generic arguments about just big taxpayers in Russia. These are very different categories of claims to make. Why are the Ukrainians making these claims? The Ukrainians are making these claims politically to justify these sorts of attacks to a Western audience. The link of this company to the war is not a central reason for Ukraine's attacks on it, right? The real reason is to secondarily generate economic damage for Russia, and in the first instance, generate social and political tension in Russia. That's the main reason. You don't name it as the main reason because Western audiences do not love the idea of civilian casualties on Russian territory. How would I analyze this attack from that point of view? Is it going to harm Ukraine's soft power? And the answer to that, in my analysis, is no. It won't do any damage to Ukraine's soft power at all. But a continued campaign of these sorts of attacks could. But even there, any soft power damage incurred will not be significant. And the reason it won't be significant is that the relationship between European powers and Ukraine is now more transactional than it used to be 2 or 3 years ago, and less based on a kind of moral outrage generated bottom up by Western citizenries. So for now, Ukraine is not in the red with that Western perception that they want to take care of. That's my analysis of that for today. Now you might say, how do we think about the ethics of this? What do questions like, is this a proportionate, is this a disproportionate attack by Ukraine mean? And I have just written a short piece on this on Substack that I'm going to put up either as this video goes up or within an hour or so of it. And you'll be able to find it via the community page on the Vlad Vexler chat channel. And what I say about it basically is a strange kind of thing to say for a moral philosopher. I say basically two things. First, that there's a risk of the over-moralization of defensive and existential war. That's to say, when you're fighting a defensive and existential war, values like justice and injustice go out of the way and are replaced by values like survival, the political and economic sustainability of one's nation, and so on. And the consequence of that in ethical terms is that Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory, for the most part, are not unjust, because they're neither just nor unjust. They are a necessary product of a defensive and existential war. Having said this, does it follow that a defensive party that's a victim of an aggressive war, that's also, at least to some extent, fighting an existential war, has a complete carte blanche on what it can do? No, it doesn't mean that. So here we need to understand two very basic principles. The first principle is this age-old distinction between justice of the initiation of the war and justice of the prosecution of the war. It's a distinction that's really important for human beings in general to keep apart. Why? It's important to keep apart because we are never going to agree on the justice of the prosecution of wars, because parties that start wars are, for the most part, wrong to start wars, but invariably claim that they are starting right and just wars, and we're never going to break that politically. But it is more plausible to break politically into the question and generate some degree of agreement on the question of how war is prosecuted, irrespectively of the justice or injustice of its initiation. And a consequence of this for Ukraine means that you can't just justify everything you do on the basis of the fact that there's an aggressor, you're the victim, and you're fighting an existential war. That there is still a separate question of the prosecution of the war, the justice of the prosecution of the war. It's just that you mustn't over-moralize that question. But that question is still there, even if it's a situation where the question of the justice of the initiation of the war has a very ugly answer, in which somebody else is the aggressor and you're the victim, and you're an innocent defending yourself and defending yourself while being existentially endangered. And that endangerment, in the case of Russia's attack on Ukraine, is also backed by genocidal language. So that means we shouldn't over-moralize Ukraine's actions on Russian soil, but there is absolutely moral consideration available to us about these actions. That's the first bit. The second bit is that there's an important principle here that applies to defensive parties in a war. And the principle says, treat, and it is a very important but completely unrealistic principle. And the principle says, treat the enemy's non-competence as you would treat your own non-competence. Right? So treat the civilians of the enemy as though they were your own civilians. No state in practice will ever do that. Therefore, the moral principle attached to this is not the principle of whether a state does this or not, but the principle that they shouldn't drift too far from doing this. So it might be that it is ethically adequate, not wonderful, because war is a universal evil, there's nothing wonderful about it. But it might be that a ratio of 1 to 5 is something that we find just about adequate, but a ratio of 1 to 50 we don't find adequate. And that principle absolutely applies to Ukraine, but the point is we've got to be slow about bringing it in, because we are talking about a situation in which, in many respects, ideas about survival and necessity come in the defense of an existential war and crowd out ethical considerations. Not completely, but to a significant degree. To get a sharper formulation of this, you can have a look at my Substack. So all of this is going to increase. Let's say one last word about the Russian side in this politically. This will force the Putin regime into certain kinds of changes. And it will force the Putin regime into an escalation of repression. Escalating repression for that regime is possible, but it certainly has risks of destabilization. However, let me re-emphasize the final point. So far, as miserable as this is for Russia socially and politically and economically, this is not yet on course to cause significant destabilization for the Putin regime. This is just an investment into a future scenario where something else might cause destabilization, and all of these factors accumulating over time, by the time this additionally externally caused destabilization comes, are going to make it worse for the Putin regime. Lots of love and talk very soon.